recording. Thank you.
Yep, there we go. Thank you. I see I was trying to do more than 3 things at once. So why do we exist? We are a team of Black investors seeking to amplify the wealth of Black families using home ownership as a catalyst. Our platform seeks to connect with white co-conspirators to inject seed funding via our LLC for the purchase of both rental property and homes. Finally, we seek to build financial literacy through using the causeway of a rent-to-own model. We have asked Justice Castaneda to come speak with us this evening about the history of redlining in Madison, in part to help everybody understand how we've gotten ourselves into this place with this generational wealth gap, and about a little bit more about the impacts of those past and current policies on our community today. Both to help us understand the history and the rationale behind the work that we're doing and what Madison Roots is doing, but also to help create a sense of urgency for the work that needs to be done. One member of our vestry, our elected board, had the opportunity to see Justice give his presentation at a Rotary Club breakfast, and he recommended that we reach out. And we're delighted that he is here with us this evening and able to offer us that presentation. So with that, Justice, I'll turn it over to you to let you introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your role here in Madison, and then to start your presentation.
All right, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Hey, first I just want to say thank you to everybody for inviting me to share the space with you guys. I appreciate it. I was telling Reverend Jones earlier that when you, as a researcher, I guess as a practitioner as well, but definitely as a researcher, you get this thing where you focus on one little thing so much, and sometimes when you get out in front of people, you think that everyone else has been there the whole journey and that they're as excited about it as you are about land use and the history of it. So I do really appreciate the opportunity, and it's also very great. We'll see how we all feel at the end of the night, but just to have folks who are interested in at least learning different perspectives about how this stuff is. I think I'll kind of talk about this. Just I'm going to go through this presentation. It is kind of a synopsis of my dissertation work, and so I'll talk about that in a little bit. But before I get into it, I'll say a little bit about me. I grew up here in Madison. Was born at home at 23 North Ingersoll Street once upon a time, and I lived in 19 places. Just for the sake of time, I won't go through them all. Before I was 18 years old, spent a bit of my childhood locked up, but definitely involved in the criminal justice system here. My mother, father, there's a sign they were just kind of too young to raise me right at the time, I think. So like a lot of kids in a similar situation, I think I was very angry, right? And I didn't really understand how to channel that or even really how to put a finger to the source of it. And it really, when I was 19 years old, I was charged with a felony here in Madison for getting in a fight. Well, I was 18 years old. I had just turned 18 as of I just turned 18, and I got in a fight at East High School, and I got charged with a felony. And it was kind of like that moment, the Robert Frost, road path diverges in the woods kind of thing. And I was very fortunate that I was able to get that charge dismissed. And I think a lot about my life and the trajectory of Latinx and boys of color and just people in general when they have a significant hurdle. It's not insurmountable, but it would have been a significant hurdle to overcome at a very young age. I worked construction for a few years, and then when I was 20 years old, I enlisted into the Marine Corps, and I spent 8 years in the Marines. And that's kind of where, when I was in the military, I had some time for reflection. If there's any Marine veterans or folks who are familiar with the service, I went into a period of sobriety when I first got in there, and it's a really interesting place to be sober. I'll say that. But there's a line in Huey Newton in his book. Says most people don't think about prison as a place to find freedom, but it was the first place that I ever found mine. And while I was in the military is really where I started getting politicized, actually, and I started reading a lot and really thinking a lot about who I was and about the way I grew up, and that turned into somewhat of an insatiable thirst for an understanding. So finished the military, and I was an educator for a few years in San Diego, and I worked at a continuation high school, working with students, teaching math, and supporting an English classroom under some really amazing people. Then ended up in grad school in the Bay Area, and then I went from there to the East Coast, and then I went back to the Bay for some more grad school, and back to the East Coast for some work. And then finally, after 19 and a half years, I came back to Madison. And throughout all that time, I say all that to say, Madison and the way that I think about this, it became kind of a muse in terms of the academic work that I was doing. So while I was at Stanford, I was studying education policy, and Madison was the focus, and looking at the disparities in Madison and really thinking about that. And I felt like in the School of Education, the Graduate School of Education there, I didn't really find the answers I was looking for. And so I ended up going to MIT to study planning and focus on economic development and industrial relations and housing policy and such. And that's where I started thinking about Madison. And during that time, I was fortunate enough to come back and work for Paul Soglin for a few years to do kind of a focused analysis on the history of land use. And that became the topic, or it became part of the research for a thesis that I completed for that. And then from there, I ended up at the medical campus at the University of California at San Francisco, and there's a lot of connections. Maybe a different day I'll run into some of you guys and I'll do that story, but a lot of connections between these things. But looking at the way that children respond to trauma, and the way that trauma, or I don't, trauma is kind of an index, it becomes kind of a catch-all. I look at it in terms of stress and cortisol regulation in the body, and because and then looking how a child's ability to manage toxic stress or the presence of stress affects cognition or cognitive development and immunoregulatory function. So basically how stress affects our ability, our immune system, and how it affects our ability to learn. And all this stuff was connected because a lot of the stressors that I looked at had to do with volatility in housing situations and living situations. So after all that, I came back to Madison. I work at an organization called Commonwealth Development. Like I said, I left Madison for 19 and a half years and came back here and started working on my dissertation, which was an attempt to try and put all this stuff together. And so with that said, I work at Commonwealth, which was created in 1979, the same year that I was born. Commonwealth Development was actually created by a lot of people as a response to violence along the Willis Street corridor at the end of the 70s and early 80s. There's a few schools of thinking around how you actually address violence. These folks came from a school of thinking that said the way you do it, you can have programs, but the focus should be about buying all the property and creating low-income housing for families. And then from there, you want to create opportunities for businesses to create an economy in the area. And then from there, you want to train the workforce to work in that economy. And after 40 years, we are here in the Marquette neighborhood and now working in Meadowwood. And that's kind of what we do. So we do a lot of how we do real estate development. So we create low-income housing and we manage our own housing. We also have it's similar, but we have another home ownership program for low to moderate income homeowners. It works in the same way that a land trust would work, except for instead of having a land lease, you work with us. So, and then we also do workforce development for youth and for adults. For adults, it's folks who are coming right out of prison or right off of the streets, and we help them find employment. And for youth, we work at all the high schools. We work with the work-based learning and youth apprenticeships work. And then we have some really great flagship programs that we do over the summer. And we're very involved in the general violence prevention efforts in Madison and Dane County, and we do a lot of work there. And just because why not, we also have an annual gala, which I invite you to. It's called the Willie Street Fair. You guys are all invited. Say my name and they'll let you in for free. No, it's a free fair here on the east side that we started, and that is our big celebration that we do every year. So that's Commonwealth, and that's the work that I do on a day-to-day basis. But we're going to be talking about the work I do as an academic work. So I'm going to jump right into this. And my understanding is I got about 25 more minutes. Is that about right? Or how am I doing with time? So I can't hear you.
I've advertised this as going until 8:30.
Okay, gotcha. So I got some time back. Just want to
Right.
make sure I'm more worried about going over. All right.
And Justice, if I can just interrupt you for a second and invite people to put questions in the chat. There are 36 people on this Zoom call right now. And so if we are all trying to ask questions at once, it'll be chaos. If you will type your questions into the chat, I will keep track of them. And then when we get to that point in the evening, I will ask Justice your questions on your behalf. Thank you. All right.
All right, sounds good. Okay, so we're gonna get going. So I kind of introduced myself so you guys know who I am. Get right into this stuff. So let me see if I can make this a little bit bigger. So this is kind of the general purpose and what we're trying to do today. I think that's a little bit too big. Get it right so you guys can see it, but not so that, just scroll around. Sorry, I use Canva, so this isn't a PowerPoint, which sometimes makes it a little bit more difficult to present.
Justice, we're seeing your email account page.
Oh, even better. All right, how are we doing now? All right. So a big thing here, that I got for folks that are familiar with researchers and dissertations and such is that there's so much work and there's a lot of things that go into this. And so this presentation is an attempt to kind of put this together through a type of synopsis. And so in addition to really going into the history and a lot of the story of redlining and how I would say pernicious housing practices in Madison and Dane County, a lot of the attempt here is going to be trying to bring it home and explain how we're still addressing a lot of the residuals and where a lot of these challenges are. All right. So Madison is its own special snowflake in that the things that we see here, there's a lot of universal general theoretical ideas that apply to a lot of places, but there's a lot of things that are very unique to Madison. And it's really important for us to understand that as we think about this. So I'll let you guys take bluff, I should say what that means. That means bottom line up front. And I'll read this just so we get a sense of just how to frame this. So housing policy affects an individual and or group of individuals' capacity for participation in different forms of democratic processes and or institutions. Due to historic land use policies and aided in part by current housing practices and structural limitations of government, many neighborhoods disproportionately represented by low to moderate income families and residents and Black and Indigenous people of color populations are compromising their capacity for collective action and or access to democratic processes and commerce. That's a lot. So I'll say this. The theoretical school of thinking that I come from is somewhat rooted in post-structuralism, meaning I don't know that a lot of what I was looking at when I was thinking about the roots of this, it didn't lend itself to thinking that there's just a cabal of people who are making a decision, and that there's a group of bad people who are making these decisions. And, so that's why we're in the situation that we're saying, that we're in terms of the disparities that we have in economic and educational outcomes for folks of color in the city of Madison. I think that there's a lot of things that are kind of layered on top of things. Definitely some individuals in there, but there's a lot of things that are happening, and it makes it very difficult to pick one thing and then say, hey, you know what, we have these disparities, so let's just fix them, or let's just do it. I think there's so many intelligent and amazing people, people who are dedicated and passionate in the city of Madison, that if it was as simple as that, if it was as simple as just flipping the switch or acknowledging one thing, I mean, we would have done it, right? I mean, there's just so many folks. So, all right. So the questions that I ask and the things that I'm looking at through this work are: why do disparities persist? And what are the epistemological ambits of understanding from which we are developing policies and interventions? And how does this work in terms of race, class, etc.? I'm sure a lot of you guys are familiar with the Race to Equity report that was done in 2013. One thing that we looked at when I was here, so I worked for Paul Soglin from 11 to 14, more or less, doing this project. What I found, kind of doing a 50-year snapshot of Madison and these reports, is that that wasn't, the 10th report that was done over that time. There's so many reports that were saying the same thing in different decades up until that point. And so even today, even with a lot of the awareness that we have about where a lot of this stuff is, these disparities continue to persist. And when we think, so one of the things that when I was doing this work with the mayor, what you're looking for is, generally speaking, if there is an ideological argument that's being, meted out in terms of policy discussions and deliberations, what is the question that we're asking, and how is that lending itself to certain solutions, certain policies, certain interventions, and what happens if you tweak it? And I think there's kind of a general question, and again, this is very reductive, and so I apologize for folks who a little bit more advanced in terms of their understanding or ability to navigate this. But one of the questions is, why are people poor? Why are people in poverty? And then you get this set of answers from it, and so you get everything. You get the because people are not working hard, because people don't have the incentives, because people don't have drive, because people don't have grit, because people are not invested. You get other things that suggest it has to do with historical oppression. It has to do with systems that have been created of the ilk of a time that supported things like slavery and colonialism, imperialism. And so we're dealing with the residuals of oppressive systems, and you get these answers. And then from those answers, you get certain sets of policy solutions and policy interventions. And an advisor and kind of a mentor of mine, working together on this, is if you change that question and you ask yourself, why does being low income make you sick? Or why does poverty have to make you sick? That question gets a new set of answers. And so where a lot of what I started thinking about in terms of the questions that we're asking is not about, what is the origin or why are people low income, but more importantly, why does being low income or being in poverty, why does that make you sick? And does it have to make you sick? And this is what I mean by this: what are the epistemological ambits of understanding from which we're developing policies and interventions? You can tell that came out of an academic document. I should say, before I get right into this, that I kind of say this at the at the end of the introduction of these kind of theoretical questions. Well, I don't think that there is I think it's too simple to just say that the reason that these disparities exist and they persist is because there's a lot of people who are racist. I don't know, it's hard to tell whether or not what someone thinks, right? And to me, the idea that there's an insubordinate group of folks who are not quite human beings, that's based on phenotypical presentation, i.e. race, I don't know what people think. I don't know what they're thinking. I can't get in their head to tell them what they're thinking. I can say that the results are obviously, and I want to emphasize this, that the results and the reality of folks of color in Madison, in particular, our Black African American population, the disparities are very real, and they are drawn along the lines of race. And I say that because in any place, a lot of folks they'll try to bring in this concept of class, and that it's class, and and people will argue about this. But what I mean by this is that the moderator. So in many places around the United States, you have disparities, but when you have parents who have high incomes or high education levels, who are very involved in their children's lives, you can mitigate some of those disparities, and you see that. And so that kind of points to this concept of class, right? That class is actually moderating a child's ability to navigate what I call democratic process institutions, but what I mean by that is the economy, our education systems, and such. In Madison, the thing that actually moderates that is race and not class. And one of the ways that you can tell that is that some of our biggest gaps, and there are many actually, the people talk about an achievement gap. I always argue that there are many, many gaps that exist in our in terms of our student population. It's not just one gap; it's many. But some of the biggest gaps are not actually between just Black folks and white folks, or folks of color and their white kind of factual. What you see is that it's specifically with the Black African American population is students whose parents are very involved in their lives, parents who have high incomes and parents who have high education levels, and their white counterparts. So if you are white and you have those things, what you see is that your educational economic outcomes, they start to, it's hard to explain without showing a graph. But basically it accelerates, and it improves significantly over time. And the biggest gap is those folks, and then the Black folks who have the same. And that's some of our biggest gaps, which I mean, and if you just think about that, it's just saying that being poor and being white, if you're those things, it's not a crystal stair there either. There's a lot of challenges that those students face. And so the gaps there are much lower than as you start to increase income level, you start to increase parental participation and parental education, you start to see those gaps getting bigger, which tells you that it isn't class alone. Race is this biggest moderator. And that is one of the things that sets Madison aside from a lot of other places. And so again, you'll hear it a lot that like everywhere has a lot of gaps, and that's true. And I'm not saying that income level is nothing. It's a lot, and it's an indicator of a lot of other things. So, all right. So Redlining Covenants. This is one of the old HOLC maps, Homeowner Loan Corporation maps of Madison, Wisconsin. You guys may recognize the bones of the city that we all live now. And what this kind of did is it explained where folks could live. This basically, if you were in the red, if you were in the blue or green, and you were not, folks of color were not allowed access into the areas that were the blue or the green, which are the best or the very desirable. Whereas the yellow and red, with conditions, they were allowed to move in there. Now, a lot of us who are familiar with Madison, we can recognize the specific. Okay, here we go. And my cursor doesn't show up here, but we can recognize the specific areas. So right here, that's obviously the first setup. That's where Tenny Lapham. A lot of people, when you talk about gentrification, you'll say that Madison had a few stages of it. One of the first stages of gentrification in Madison was in the Tenny Lapham neighborhood, and then down here, a lot of people will recognize the Greenbush neighborhood that, as many of us know, during urban renewal in the mid 20th century, that was, a lot of people were displaced. That was a historic Jewish, Italian, and Black neighborhood that was displaced. And then from there, when the displacement of the Greenbush happened, there were only a few places in the city of Madison where Black folks were allowed to own property, and they were all at the periphery of the city. This map, I'm trying to think if I went through this, but when I'll come back to it in a second. We're going to look at some contemporary maps that go through the racial, the distribution in terms of where folks live today, and you'll see that there's a pattern that exists. It's not exactly the same places. Again, a lot of us recognize Madison is the Broadway Simpson. I think now it's called Winona Lake Point. We recognize the Darbo area, and we definitely recognize the Park Street T, or the South, what's conventionally called the South Side of Madison, on this map. And as we know, in terms of the way that the population is distributed right now, a lot of those neighborhoods hold. But one of the things that we're going to see here, with the exception of the Greenbush and that first settlement neighborhood, is that the concept or the pattern you're seeing here is peripheralization. And so the populations are pushed to the periphery. And a lot of this is, again, at this time, it was done by the Hulk maps, or the ways that they would allow or not allow people access to financing to purchase homes, and or where they actually had restrictive covenants that said people were not allowed to own homes. Now, two things happened in the mid to late 20th century. So this still goes into a lot of the definitions of redlining and covenants, but basically what this is saying is that by statute, folks of color, and at this time, we're primarily talking about Black African-American population in Madison, that could not live in certain housing in the city of Madison. So the Marquette neighborhood, not Willie Street, but anything closer to the lake going south, Black folks, folks of color, even on today, some folks who still have those old deeds will look on there and they'll show that the original deed said that folks of color were not allowed to live there. Same thing with the Monroe Street area. Throughout the city of Madison, basically, where you look at where, I don't like saying the desirable parts of Madison, because, you know, I'm from here, I lived all over this town. I like Madison. I think all the places are very desirable, but you guys know what I mean. What folks are saying by that really could be expressed in property value. But a lot of places that have the highest property value, that, and I'm kind of stepping on the punchline, I'm going to get to this, but it also today, the places that have really great access to transit, that have that are walkable neighborhoods, all these things are neighborhoods where Black folks were not allowed to buy property up until the end of the 20th century. Now, even so, this period between 1940 and 1970, there were two landmark legislations and Supreme Court decisions that affected this process. Now, the first one was obviously the 1948 Supreme Court decision that said that restrictive practices are no longer enforceable. It didn't make them illegal. So you could still do it. They just were not enforceable. And so if they were taken to court, you couldn't enforce these anymore, but it didn't stop people from doing it. And the second thing that I found, I looked at this, is that there's a lot of plats and there's a lot of parcels in Madison that what happened is they started saying, well, okay, if we know that the writing's on the wall, so if they're no longer enforceable, to have racial restrictions on the deed itself, what we're going to start to do is we're going to start to put other covenants on the deed that are not going to explicitly say race, but they're going to say it in a different way. And a lot of what that means, or how that worked, is that you're not allowed to build multifamily housing. And so in essence, what they said is that at the time, if we can't explicitly say that folks of color are not allowed to buy property, or they're not allowed to live in this area, what we will do is we will look at the type of housing that they're going to need, or that they're going to be looking for, and we're going to make that type of housing illegal without saying anything about them. And today, many of these covenants are still in effect. A lot of what we know is the Raymond Road corridor on the west side, in and around those areas. If you look at those properties, this deed restrictions will say there's no multifamily housing allowed in those areas. And if you do try to, basically you every parcel and their lender, every property owner and their lender in the entire plat gets served. And if any of them object, you cannot do your property. So this is just an example. This actually wasn't just Wisconsin. This started happening around the country in different places that had pernicious redlining. What they started doing is using these tools or these types of tools to prevent people from actually bringing in housing that would support the communities of color. So until 1968, when the Fair Housing Act came, this was in practice. So you got 20 years after the Supreme Court decision that it was still in effect. It just wasn't enforceable. It wasn't made illegal until 1968. Now, when we think about this in terms of where people live and why it matters, and for us, we understand Madison and its geography. It's interesting. When I was doing this, I was working in a university where that wasn't in Madison, and so folks didn't know Madison from one place or the other. And something that one of my advisors was she was like, "Why do you keep saying that this downtown area is the center of the city? Why do you think this is the center?" And I was like, "Well, because it is." And so I had to look up the definition of a center, and a center is a point on a plane that is equidistant from all of the points in the same plane. By definition, it's not the center. Now it's kind of the middle, but the lakes do this thing to it that peripheralize the city. So if you were really looking for an access point that had equidistance to all other points on the same plane, meaning on the same land, you actually would say that there's two centers, right? Madison has a couple centers, one of which would be somewhere over here, what I would call the University Park area. And you can see what I mean by, like that's a center. And then over, kind of by, when I was growing up, it was a Cub Foods. I think the Fleet Services building is over there now, and Walmart on the east side, because the intra-neighborhood, in terms of where you would develop economy, if you were trying to give folks universal access to the economy that's in the center of a city, this is where you would put it. By putting it here, you automatically get this issue of peripheralization, because again, everything's running in there. We'll come back to this in a little bit, but it's really important to understand that when we're talking about exclusion and where the housing was, it wasn't just about being in an area that was just like less desirable in terms of the land, which was the case, and that was happening as well. It was also in terms of where you had access, in terms of access to the economy, access to transit, access to all these other things. So I use this map. I have to update this. I should say this is still, it's actually a little bit, it's more pronounced today because there's a few more folks of color today in Madison than there were in 2010, but the 2020 census, it still kind of holds. I have to update this map though, but what you see here is that from that initial map, again, the neighborhoods in some ways have changed. So it's not just about the exact same places, but that pattern of peripheralization, it holds. So this is what you're looking at right here is where our Black folks live in the city of Madison. Right here, you're seeing where Latinx folks live in the city of Madison. And you can tell that for folks of color, we're still at the periphery of the city. And that alone, I want to stop and just think about this. When we started thinking, one of the things that you're asked when you come up with a point with your dissertation work or with any research, in this case, it was my thesis a few years ago, is the so what? So you come up with this thing and you say, well, peripheralization. The next question is like, well, so what? What does that mean? Give me an example. So one of the examples I looked at, we're all familiar with disparities in police contact, but one of the things I looked at was DUI, so driving under the influence. And I'm not promoting, this is water, by the way, but I'm not promoting, excessive drinking. I'm not saying that it's a good thing or a bad thing. I am saying that it's a cultural thing, and it is not uncommon for anybody of any ilk in Madison to have a drink. I mean, people go on dates, people go to happy hours, they do all these things. When if you were to randomly pull out of a hat, because if you're looking at where folks live and you look at where people live, and then you say, how far would they have to drive, or how far would they have to go to a place where they could have a glass of wine on a date? You see that just unto that by itself in the city of Madison, someone who's folks of color are going to have to go further to go on a date. They're going to have to go further to do a lot of the things, basic leisure, basic economy, basic commerce, than their white counterpart. Another huge example, and I'm going to say I'm not condoning car theft for any reason, so I got to put that out there first. But while Commonwealth, we work with Madison Police Department, they asked us to put together a youth advisory board to the chief of kids who could articulate some of the critiques and criticisms, but engage in a constructive dialogue about a lot of the challenges that children are facing or feeling as it pertains to the relationships between them and police. And it's actually been a very humbling, it's just been such an amazing experience watching these youth work, and develop some of these thoughts and lines of critique of the police chief. And I've actually been very impressed by his willingness to engage in constructive dialogue over this past year and a half. One of the things that he asked about was car thefts, and something that the kids came up with at first, and they said it, it was kind of in passing, but they mentioned about transit. And so from that, we kind of looked into it, and sure enough, Madison doesn't have a culture of chopping per se. What I mean by that is when people are stealing cars, they're not taking them to a chop shop and chopping them down and selling them in places that are closer to freeways or places, San Diego, where I lived for a number of years. When cars got stolen, you could take those things across the border. Kids would take them across the border. Madison, you're seeing a lot of the kids who are stealing cars are younger. Something that we showed the police chief and that the kids kind of noticed is that the places where we have the highest amounts of car thefts in the city of Madison are places where the transit is the worst. Again, I'm not saying that it's an excuse. I'm just saying that if you live in Meadowood Park or Teresa Terrace and you try to take a bus to to Westtown, it takes longer to take a bus to Westtown, which is over here, than it does to take a bus to downtown. So our intra-neighborhood and a lot of the intra-neighborhood transit and a lot of the neighborhoods that our folks of color live is the worst in the city. To get from Kennedy Heights on the north side to Teresa Terrace on the southwest side on public transit takes just under 2.5 hours. Now think about that. That's a 25-minute car ride. I could drive to Milwaukee, eat lunch, and drive back in the time that it takes to take public transit across the city. From where I'm sitting on Williamson Street to take a bus to Tenney Park, which is across the isthmus, I have to go to Woodman's on the, like our intra-neighborhood transit. It's not set up for intra-neighborhoods. It's set up to go through this down, everything is based. So this kind of, in the actual research, I go into this in much greater length, but a lot of the flow, the natural flow of commerce, including transit, still flows as if this downtown area is actually the center. There is no way to navigate these neighborhoods on either side, the north side, far east side, west side, south side, southwest side. You can't get around those neighborhoods in a way that makes sense, that you could use the transit to do something like, and this is, following the patterns of the police reports of the stolen cars. It's like kids are stealing a car, they drive around, pick some friends up, then they go to the drive-through at McDonald's, and then they drive around, and then they go to Westtown, and then they drive around and they drop the car off, or they get in a police chase, leave it in a Target parking lot. That's joyriding, and again, it's problematic and it's very dangerous. I'm not condoning it, but I am saying that if there was a way, I think about this, living in places that have very integrated transit systems where you can get around your neighborhoods, and it's a practical way to get to and fro in your neighborhood. The idea that you need to come up with a car to get to basic places for commerce and leisure is foreign. All right. So one of the things with this, and kind of moving into like, all right, so with The Redlining Covenant. So what is it saying in terms of today? What do we have today? What does this mean? So the city of Madison, I think my maps got kind of switched, and I don't know how that happened, so I apologize. This is the city of Madison's neighborhood resource team map. Neighborhood resource team. These are neighborhoods, you know, for the people who have been doing policy work, neighborhood work in Madison, you know the neighborhoods by name. But the city has these neighborhoods, and you ask the city, well, what is it, what is it that they're showing? And they'll tell you, I'll say they'll tell you that it has something to do with building inspection violations, something to do with crime or police calls, and something to do with public health indicators. I would say the last thing may be the only thing that is accurate. Because you notice that the 600, 800 blocks of University Avenue is not on this map. Whereas if you look on any given month and you look at where there's police calls, that's one of your highest areas in the city of Madison for police calls. But that's not on this map. The other thing that kind of struck me is that the neighborhoods don't change over time. And that's very bizarre, and especially when there's certain neighborhoods in here like the South Side, which in terms of police calls, there's just not a lot. It doesn't make sense. But what did they show? They show, if you did a scatter plot of where folks of color live in the city of Madison, that's what it shows. That shows you that, right? These are places where folks of color live in the city of Madison for sure. But it also showed a few other things that I thought was really interesting. And one of them is that it shows areas that have very high housing turnover on an annual basis. And so these kind of peripheral, and then it's also areas that are extraordinarily low income, right? And so there's these little places there. I want to talk about the housing thing, and because it kind of, I think, resonates with a lot of what the organization and the effort that you guys are supporting is getting at. But our lowest income neighborhoods, when we started looking at a lot of these neighborhoods, I looked specifically at Brentwood. I looked a lot at the Southwest corridor here, Park Edge, Park Ridge, Hammersley, Teresa Terrace, Balsam, Russet, and Allied. The lowest income folks are turning over annually at a clip of, at the time, 50 to 60%. When you talk to elementary schools, and they'll tell you that the kids, their lowest income students, are turning over 50 to 60% annually. The way I put it is like, it doesn't matter who you have teaching at that school. If your children are turning over that rapidly, you are going to struggle developing relationships with them and their families, and your school is going to struggle. And it doesn't have anything to do with the quality of teachers or the quality of the school or any of these other things. It has all to do with the fact that so much of education is based on relationships. When I worked at a school in Oakland, California, 99.9% extreme poverty, meaning very low income students, you could walk to every student's house from the school. You will, you're working with very low income families who are also struggling, they're in the struggle, they're dealing with a lot of things, but you would work with their siblings. You get to know the family. You knew mom, you knew the sister, you knew the brother, you knew the whole family because they all went through your school. In Madison, that's not the case. Kids are moving all over. Like I said, I mean, kind of one of the things I kind of write in the beginning of this thing is I moved 19 times when I was a child, before I was 18 years old. A lot of our kids, when you think about where you're from, we move all over the city of Madison. And so this volatility in housing is something that is also very unique, that we don't have these permanent neighborhoods. When I talked a couple slides ago, it talks about peripheralized pockets of concentrated poverty. One of the things that you see with a lot of these neighborhoods, there's no commerce. There's no, even in the lowest income neighborhoods in many cities. I mean, I could just rattle them off, but the point is that having a low income neighborhood in general, no matter what it is, people still have to engage in commerce. They still have to go to stores. They, like I was saying about having places where you can go on a date. These things still exist. There is some semblance of an economy, whereas our neighborhoods is just not the way they are. Many of them, if you think about isolation, if you're familiar with Allied Drive and or Darwell Worthington, both those neighborhoods, the turnoff, by the time you see the neighborhood, you've already passed it, right? So they are, and that frontage road for either of those things, it's horrible for businesses because if you set up a business there, by the time you see the business, you've already passed the exit to get to it. So, you know, you have these things that again prevent these cities, these neighborhoods from actually becoming neighborhoods. If you think about the Marquette neighborhood where, you know, I work and where we work, if your sink breaks, you can walk, you know, operative concept here is walk to house to get a pipe to fix your sink. And if you're walking back, you can stop at the co-op and get a bag of oranges. If you know, you're walking still and like you can stop at a florist and get plants or flowers for someone that you care about. Or there's taverns and taverns that are in the neighborhood. Like, yes, again, I'm not being over celebratory of alcohol. However, these taverns, you could also stop at one of them and, you know, run for governor. Or you could start, you know, you can engage in solving those problems like people are probably doing right now at many of these taverns. Point is, they're multi-purpose and they serve to create that kind of neighborhood cohesion. When industry left these neighborhoods, you kind of had a very eclectic building stock. And so you can walk. But the other thing about the Wither Street, never think about it, you can walk from a destination, you can walk downtown and it doesn't feel like you walked very far because there's so much happening. There's destinations. When we get into a lot of our neighborhoods at the periphery, not only are there no sidewalks, but there is no destination. There is no nothing. There's nothing at the end of the street. It just goes around and around, you know, there's meandering streets. So back to the volatility, a lot of what we understand about volatility in these neighborhoods are evictions. Evictions are really important. It's really important that we're doing a lot of things to address or to promote eviction prevention wherever we can. And there's a lot of things, everything from rental assistance to legal advocacy. Tenant Resource Center does phenomenal work right now with core funding to support folks who have been affected in terms of employment over the pandemic. The work of Urban Triage, the Community Action Coalition is just phenomenal work. And these folks are out here doing some really great things to prevent evictions. It's very important. Volatility is really what I'm getting at. And there's a lot of reasons that people move, some of which are evictions, some of which, so evictions in general, they fall into two categories. It's either lease violations or rent, right? You can't pay your rent. The way that we developed our neighborhoods and a lot of the housing that exists in our low-income places, and I'm going to go back to this map, what you find is that a lot of it's what's called income restrictive rentals. So what that means is that if you live in those places and you live in one of the units, Commonwealth has many. I mean, a lot of the housing that we took over in Meadowwood is all income restrictive housing. Now, if you live in those units and you have to recertify annually, so you are renting a house or renting an apartment, every year you have to recertify. Well, if I were to rent an apartment as me, I have to get into the house the one time. I have to provide all of the information, and then what happens is if I want to renew the lease, the landlord or the property owner gets a hold of me at, you know, somewhere at the latter, you know, whatever, end of the third quarter of my lease and says, hey, you want to stick around? And I say, yeah, I want to stick around. And they send me a lease, I sign it, and then that's it. It's a very simple process. It happens, you know. Whereas if you're in income restricted housing, you have to recertify your credit, your, you know, all these other things every year and annually. Now, one of the byproducts of this is that you can't make more money. Because if you increase your rent so that you increase your income so that it exceeds the limitation, the rent limit or the income limit on the housing that you're in, you have to move out. our neighborhoods, because the housing that we've developed is all this type of rentals, there is no place. So like Meadowood is a good example where you have very low income housing and then very expensive detached single family homes. There's nothing in the middle. So going back to volatility and saying that if children are moving around, you have this situation where the neighborhoods that we've built to support our lowest income populations have a built-in type of volatility in that the vast majority of the housing in there are income restricted rentals. And so even if you go in there and you have a program that's going to get somebody a job and they're going to increase their, they're going to have to move. And so that's a structural challenge that we have with stabilization that has been a product or a residual of housing policies at the municipal level that follows the pattern of peripheralization that was started with the redlining and the restrictive covenants when we started doing the land use restrictions as the city was developed. So the point and the way that I'm bringing that up is to try and start to show that path, right? That we had these practices that were restrictive and that were segregative, that segregated the population at its inception through redlining and racial restrictive covenants. The type of housing that was then developed for our lowest income population, which has to do with past but also present housing policies, made it so that the neighborhoods where folks of color could live had volatility built into it. And this volatility is affecting our ability to navigate or people's ability to access those democratic process institutions that I talked about at the beginning of the presentation. All right. So I'll let you guys just kind of look at this. This is a lot of what I just said. Matter of fact, I should have just read the slide. It would have saved us like 10 minutes. I bring this up, the housing of all types. If you're familiar with the housing conversation in Madison and a lot of the discourse from elected officials and such, this is what they're saying. There's a lot of advocacy groups that are saying we need housing of all types. Because the argument they're saying is that the reason that housing costs are so high is because of the supply of housing is so low. So there's not enough housing for people to live in, which basic economics said that's gonna, if you have a very low amount of a commodity and you have very high demand for that commodity, the price of the commodity is gonna go up. Now, for folks who, the critical thinkers probably also are probably thinking, is housing a commodity or is it a public good? That's another conversation that I think we should keep there and be thinking about. However, we'll just hold on to it for a second, say it's a commodity because we're paying money. The argument, so that part of it is true, that to a certain degree, the low stock or low, the vacancy rate, the fact that we have under 2.5%, generally speaking, a healthy vacancy rate in the municipality is about 5%. We're, somewhere north of 2% or hovering, straddling 2%. So we have very low vacancy rate, which will tell you that housing is going to be expensive. However, to address it, we would have to create housing at the clip of 20 to 30,000 units a year to really address the actual cost of housing. And it's hard to, in general conversation and just politically charged space to make that, it's hard for people to get past that because they're like, wait, what do you mean? We just need any housing is good, because if you build more housing, then people will live in it. Now, there's two things that are happening here. The first thing is there's this concept of filtering is what it's called. But basically what it says is that if you build luxury housing, if you build very expensive market rate housing, what will happen is that middle to upper class people or people who are making higher incomes will move into that housing. And then when they move into that housing, the housing they were living in, which would hold is going to be ostensibly is going to be older housing, will then be open. So they won't be taking up that housing. And then that housing, because it's older, because it's not the new housing, low-income people can move into that housing, so you'll open that up. Now, that's very good as a rhetorical device. In practice, you'd be hard-pressed to find any example in the United States where that's actually ever worked. And part of the reason is because cities are not in a box or a bubble, so the population you have in a municipality is not fixed. It's not just, that you don't have 10 people that live in a place and then you build new housing and then the top 3 people move into it and then, it moves up like that. You have what's called an import effect. The University of Wisconsin, it turns out Madison is home to 4 governments and a flagship university. And this is a great thing for the city. It's why I call them Charlie Alpha cities. What that means is capital cities that have a flagship university in them. There's a number of them: Tucson, Des Moines, Lincoln, are all examples. I mean, there's a number of these cities. And so putting those in the category, these cities are always going to do better in housing crashes and in general, because the governments themselves are going to bring in a lot of people. However, a second order effect is we have an import effect. So Madison's housing demand is exogenous as much as endogenous, meaning a lot of the people who need housing are people who want to come here. Now, every year, as again, not because we're a bad place, but Madison imports white people, right? Like we do, and the university. So it imports a bunch of white folks to the city every year. Now, that matters because sometimes you'll hear people say that Madison is 10% or that 17% folks of color and all that isn't wrong if you take a point in time count and you say who's here at any given moment. However, something that was brought to me when I was doing this research was the school district has been gradually approaching 70% folks of color over the last 30 years. So how could your school district be increasing at that clip and your population of folks of color is that low? And so what someone asked me to do is to look at who's born here. And when you find and you look at who's born in the city in any given year, it's closer to 50-50, right? Because a lot of the folks who come here were not born here. I mean, everybody understands that. So that import effect, it affects the way that we look at it. So that's the first thing, the concept of filtering. The second big thing with the housing of all types, or the big issue with the housing of all types, is that, as we talked about, a lot of where you're going to see your market rate housing and the expensive housing is going to be in the places that are the most desirable, meaning they have the best access to transit, best access to parks, all these other things. And so what you're going to get is what we're having now, where you're getting market rate or soon to be market rate housing coming to all the places where there's good transit. And then a lot of your low-income housing is happening at the periphery. Low-income housing development is happening at the periphery, further separating or stratifying where people live. All right, so I've talked a lot about this. Where this goes right now is into a lot of it's going to start getting into a lot of what's happening today and the challenges that we're having today in terms of addressing this. I will pause because I do want to real quick see if there's anything in terms of the history of the land use or the history of the redlining in Madison that maybe wasn't clear, or maybe there's some that I should come back to. If it's a general question about this, I can save that to the end, but I do want to get into this next piece. So I don't know, hands, or if there's anything about just the redlining that people want to talk about.
So we do have a couple of questions that have come in through the chat, Justice, but I don't think they pertain specifically to the history. A couple people were curious about the NRT map and what that was demonstrating for us.
Well, what I was showing, yeah, good point. So
It can be done soon. Are you leaving me?
What happened? So what I was showing here, what the NRT map shows, this is the way the city looks at, people will say troubled neighborhoods, all these other things. What I'm showing, but I use this map just because it's a very good visual representation of where folks of color live in the city, and just kind of representing and reinforcing that concept of peripheralization that I talked about. So that's why I use this. There's a lot more that I could say about this in terms of the way that we think about these NRTs, and the way that, again, it's been kind of a stagnant concept that the city hasn't really done a whole lot. I mean, there's a lot of great work that they've done, and I should say that the people who are involved in them are very passionate and dedicated folks. That's a little bit of a digression in terms of the NRTs. What I wanted to just show and to highlight is that these neighborhoods that the NRTs outline are areas that have that high volatility that I was talking about. So the majority, there's a couple of them actually that do a good job. But the majority of these neighborhoods, what you see is very high turnover on an annual basis. And so if it holds that these are also a lot of your lowest income neighborhoods, and then also a lot of the areas where you have concentrations of folks of color, what it's showing is that in these neighborhoods, this is what you're seeing. It's a product of housing volatility, housing volatility is a product of the housing practices in these neighborhoods. Does that answer that question? Hopefully that does.
Yeah.
That's why I use that.
So the redlining and housing policies have segregated people of color into those neighborhoods, and then we see all of these difficulties there. The volatility and all the other things that you've mentioned are happening in those places that were essentially created by those housing policies.
Right. And again, so back to this, the school district elementary attendance districts, I have 40 some pages about this alone, just because it's so I don't know if you can see it here. I'm going to look at a different map and see if it's a little bit easier to see real quick. I just want to show you guys something. It's the same map, but it's a different version of it. And I just want to make some of you guys might be familiar with this. You guys should be able to see this. This is on my, this area over here. Oh man, now I can't. Now you guys can't see my. Let's see, maybe it'll work. This is so light that it's hard to see this, but basically Stevens Elementary School is this little block here, this block here, this block down here, and then this block here. That's one elementary school feeder district. In the middle of this is where Muir is. I mean, and then how it works, and they're all bused into this neighborhood. Another good example of how this, in terms of the way housing is, this is Brentwood neighborhood right here that I have up this little box. The students from Brentwood go to school at Emerson, right down here. Now, why they go to Emerson and not any of the 4 elementary schools that are closer to it, and this is, I remember I was talking about being able to walk to our schools. So these neighborhoods, there are only 3 schools in the city of Madison that are in neighborhoods that are folks of color. So Mendota, Leopold, and Lincoln. Some could argue Orchard Ridge is kind of right on the border of an area, but the rest of them, you have to planes, trains, and automobiles. No, you don't have to take planes, but you have to travel some distance to get to them. So the history, going back to that conversation of redlining and where people had access to housing, in our lowest, where you had access to housing, if you were a person of color, particularly Black and African American folks, were in places that did not have schools. All the schools were in these neighborhoods that had historically redlined properties. So the Marquette School, Shank School. It's interesting because a lot demographically right now, there's less and less families around those schools. Whereas, again, going back to the idea that if you look at where all the schools are, so you look, and again, I'm realizing that this probably is not showing up. I mean, you guys all have access to this, but you go look at where all the schools are, and then you look at, again, where we have and again, the neighborhood resource centers is what this is showing, but you look at where we have concentrations of folks of color, again, as a product of housing practices, you see that there are very few neighborhoods of color, and it gets even more exacerbated because there's way more elementary schools than high schools, but none of the high schools are in neighborhoods that are in close proximity to folks of color. All of them are areas where you got to move away from. Now in Oakland, the school that I worked at was right in the middle of the neighborhood where all the families live. Now that serves as it's a couple of purposes, but one of it is that when kids are running around in the neighborhood, everybody knows them and they know everybody. Whereas now when you go to a school, you don't know anybody in the neighborhood around the school that you go to, because you bust in there from all over the city of Madison. And so the idea of a connection or being able to actually and again, almost 70% of our students right now are folks of color in the city of Madison Metropolitan School District. None of our high schools are in neighborhoods that are folks of color. And this, again, in just following this pattern, is a product of the history of restrictive housing practices and policies in the city and as the city developed. So what this is getting at, and where I go into this, and I'll kind of run through this stuff, but I was on the committee that looked at whether we should have EROs or SROs, school resources officers, police in schools, whatever you want to call it, in our schools. We did this work for almost 2 years for the school district, and a lot of what we found was, well, what we found, in some ways is, water is wet, the sky is blue, grass is green, but a lot of what we found is that the police were kind of a symptom of a host of other things. And one of the things that stood out, and this is where I started getting a lot of this good data and information, or at least an inkling in terms of where to look about the relationship between housing volatility and student performance, and where we were seeing this was through this work in EROs. But what we found is that the crux of a lot of the things that actually police were being asked to address were things like housing insecurity, or the fact that children were moving all around, or the fact that children didn't have a sense of place when they went into the schools because they weren't in the place that they lived. The schools were far away. So that, again, I'm not saying that gives you license to do whatever you want, but I am saying that not having a feeling of belonging, I don't know that I have the same feeling of responsibility to that space. I definitely don't have the same feeling of accountability. So I talked about this all right, and it's interesting. It's the way it's. So a lot of what with the education stuff, I can, like I said, I'm going to jump through a lot of this. But basically, what you start to see is that the history of housing, in terms of the way that it affects community level violence, transit, and then health, in terms of the proximity both to toxic spaces, meaning Madison doesn't have heavy industry in the way that a San Diego had the naval yards, or there's a lot of cities that were much more industrial that were on the coast than Madison. A lot of the areas that we have that are earth dirty, excuse me, meaning that the ground is contaminated. The ground is contaminated due to industry, the KIP, and then also where you have perchloroethylene or dry cleaners, gas stations and such. But the likelihood of living near an area that is contaminated increases if you are living in one of the neighborhoods where all of our folks of color live in the city of Madison. But more important, or as important than just what I call ground contamination, is noise. And so this matters. There's a neighborhood in Fitchburg it's on King James Way, that on the backside of King James Way, they have a rock crushing operation. So that kind of noise that you listen to, that comes from being by a freeway or a main arterial corridor is very real. And, this is, I think, the crux of a lot of people's apprehensions around the F-35s in the neighborhoods that are in close proximity to. So whenever we do this, I should say that one of my, I agree with the spirit of a lot of what people's concerns are. I think the concerns of children's health should be paramount in terms of all the decisions that we make. And I always encourage folks who are really upset about the noise from the F-35s to look at, I have about 13 other, a list of 13 things that also are affecting the health of children due to proximity to contaminated spaces that are actually in the purview of our city government. And I would hope that they are as concerned about those things and the way that we do low-income housing development in Madison as they are about the F-35s. All that to say, the likelihood of you living in a close proximity to a toxic space or to an area that is not healthy in the city of Madison increases as you increases if you are living in an area that is predominantly folks of color. I'm going to talk 45 seconds about the task force on the structure of government and what we found with this. I'll let you guys read that. And then I'll show you one other map. This is actually the government structure stuff was something I had never thought about. When I started doing this work, so I did this for 2 years. I was appointed to the task force on government structure in 2017, and we were, kind of a review of who and how the government serves, in terms of its population and the ways that it supports folks. One of the things, so I'm gonna stop that. I'm going to show you this. This is the task force on government structure, a lot of the same maps. What this is showing you right here, this purple map is the boards, commissions, and committees. So if you look at the history of who has been on boards, commissions, and committees, or who is on at any given moment, what we found is that the boards, commissions, and committees in the city of Madison are overly represented by the isthmus. So when you actually, and one of the things that this is actually obfuscated a little bit because of the size of the city, but when you go into places where you have folks of color, they're not represented at all. But really what you're saying is that the neighborhoods that are predominantly white have a significant influence on all decisions that are made about everything in the city of Madison. But this is the one that I like to show folks. Now, this is dated. I actually chaired the redistricting committee for the city of Madison. And so these districts have shifted a little bit. But one of the things that you see, and I'm asking you to look at the southwest, I can't, this thing won't let me highlight, but the southwest, and you can see that I'm using these NRTs again. But one of the things in the southwest area, so we're looking at districts 1, 7, 20, 9, 19, 10, and 14. So you have this whole corridor that's made up of these neighborhoods, concentrations of folks of color that are all in 9 different districts. So you look at like Park Edge, Park Ridge, which is one neighborhood, it's split between 3 districts. So you have a concentration of folks of color that is in district 1, 20, and 19. Now, to be an alder in the city of Madison, you have to live in the district. Now, I talked to you guys earlier about volatility, and the fact is that in a lot of our lowest income neighborhoods, you have extreme volatility on an annual basis. Now, what does that mean? That means that you can't be an alder. So if I live in Park Edge, Park Ridge, and I move to Meadowood, I cannot be an alder. And if I move from Meadowood to Allied Drive, I cannot be an alder. Allied Drive to Leopold can't be an alder. If I live over here in Brentwood and I move across Warner Park into the Woodland Apartments, I can't be an alder. If I move from Woodland Apartments to Northport Apartments, can't be an alder. Northport Apartments to Truax, can't be an alder. Truax to Darbo, I can't be an alder. What does that mean? That means that the concept of collective action, the idea that you can engage in political action or you can organize your communities or the communities of color to actually advocate for policies or things like transit is compromised by where you live. And this is by the way that we've cut up these districts. Now, doing a real quick rewind, what am I saying here? Well, the history of redlining segregated and stratified the areas where folks of color could live. Historic and contemporary housing policies codified that peripheralization, and they introduced this concept of volatility that disproportionately affects our neighborhoods that remain peripheralized where you have concentrations of folks of color. Now, if you live in those neighborhoods, which are again overly represented by folks of color, you are going to be compromised in terms of your access to economic democratic process institutions, one of which the example was the school district in our schools, which is the commons. The next is political action. And so because and by virtue of living in the neighborhood, by the virtue of the way that the neighborhoods are laid out and where our populations live, they're compromised in terms of their access to democratic processes. There's a number of things that we did, that we recommended in that task force that actually aimed to address it. It was captured. I'm not a politician, so I don't think like that. So there's a lot of things that we recommended. Like Madison has 20 alders. The city of San Diego, for 1.8 million people, has 8. Atlanta, 3.5 million people, there's 16. All of those, Madison, it's not even close. Like in the history or in any other city. Now they're part-time, so what we found, you have to live in one place. So when we're saying that the transient population is overwhelmingly represented by folks of color, in essence, that's preventing folks from serving. And the other thing is that so what we found is that we looked at the history of the alders in the city of Madison, and to be an alder and to actually put the time in, you have to be either independently wealthy, you have to be retired, or you have to have a job that allows you the flexibility to go to meetings in the daytime. So a lot of our lowest income population in the city of Madison, which is again overly represented by folks of color or disproportionately represented by folks of color, do not have access to electoral processes by way of becoming an elected official under the current structure. And there's a lot, again, that's its own thing. But this is one of the things that came out of this, is that, again, a lot of what the challenges that we came up with are actually based, or at least rooted in part, by the history of housing in the city of Madison. And a lot of this, one of the things that it does that doesn't have anything to do with housing per se, is the way that our government is structured to actually address these, housing itself, land use, these are long game issues. These things take decades in some cases to, the Marquette neighborhood work that we started in 1979, we're still here, like it takes decades to actually come in here and advocate and do this stuff. If your council turns over at the rate that our council does, it makes it very difficult politically for us to address a lot of these things, which I'm not saying is the reason, but I think it is definitely a reason why these things persist, even though that we all see them, right? And we all know them, is that our council is turning over at such a rapid clip that it's very hard for that body to address the long game as it pertains to land use. All right. Contemporary housing patterns moderated by historical and contemporary land use policies and practices significantly contribute to housing volatility. Volatility in housing tenure is an undercurrent in the pathological associations we make with concentrated poverty. Impediments in access to democratic processes and/or institutions is detrimental to collective efficacy, and the structure of our local governments limits the long-term mitigation strategies that we have at our disposal, i.e., it's very difficult for a municipal government to address these issues due to internal and political organization. All right, that's a lot. Again, I I will open it to you all. Like I said, I appreciate you guys letting me run through that. There's so much, as I go through this, there's always like, a chapter or whatever that's with every one of these slides. And I always feel like when I give the shorthand, I'm like leaving so much out, but
Yeah, that was really great. I think what we heard a lot of this evening is the long-term and enduring impact of housing practices and policies that started in the last century. Do you think that those practices and policies still exist sort of underground today? Or have they started to fade?
I don't think it's underground. I think that it's still, I mean, these things, the transit system, I think, the bus rapid transit thing, in my opinion, it's going to be you're running into a conundrum, and I don't lay this at the mayor or the city council or the city's feet, because they're inheriting something that is very complex, because you have this issue where you need to make sure that you have critical ridership to pay for this system. But what you're doing, and you look at who actually is going to have access to this thing, it's going to be it cuts off a lot of our lowest income neighborhoods. So right now, that's sitting in front of us. It's something that's happening right now. I think when you're looking at the housing that's being developed, Commonwealth, when we talk, we use low income. We don't use affordable, because affordable is this index that allows people to what we're saying is that it's the bottom 3 quintiles of the income distribution of the city. We're not going to play games with this thing about income, because what people do is they use the area median income and the percentages of it. So this is a lot of what we found both in the ERO stuff and in the task force on government structure, is that a lot of the housing that's being built that is getting subsidized is affordable. The rents are actually set. There's 2 things that go on. One of which is that it's 80%, meaning you can make up to $72,000 to live, and still live in what's called affordable housing. Now, the folks that we're working with, the people who are working with in our programs, the people who are working with in our housing, the families of the youth that we work with in our programs don't make anything near that. So like that's more than, because so you get that. And the other thing that you're seeing with a lot of the housing that's being developed is that the screening criteria to get into it asks for people to make either 2.5 or 3 times the income. That's one of the little things. So you have this caveat that to get into the housing, and there's good reasons behind the income, I should say. Part of it is that if you live in a housing and you're paying more than 50% of your income on housing, it's called being extremely rent burdened. And so the argument is that if you pay that much for housing, something else in terms of your basic needs is going to be compromised. So, you're going to have to pay, how are you going to eat? How are you, all these other things. So there's these other things that this is happening very real. Now, the other thing is that, so low income housing, to create low income housing, the broadest strokes definition is that it's a function of acquisition costs and density. So I have to be able to acquire a property that I can develop at a low enough price. And then I have to be able to create enough units to be able to pay the debt service. Now, if my product or what I'm trying to do is keep the rent way below market rate, so keeping the rent low, what neighborhood association, there was this article that was written, that was saying that the 2 neighborhood associations in Madison, I won't, without getting into it, I won't have enough time to articulate it and get into the nuances of the positions, but just 2 neighborhoods that are in and around the isthmus saying that they really want low income, they want more affordable housing. Well, true, but that's like, I want, it's like, it's very easy to say that, but when you bring a proposal to them that suggests you need it to be high, or you need it to be dense, or you need, they don't want that project though, and so like, it's another way of saying they don't want low income housing, even though it's cavalier to say that we want more affordable housing. Well, if you're trying to actually create affordable housing, unless you are giving me the land, it is very difficult for us to create that if we can't add more units. So just buying, a property, and because I have to pay the more, I have to pay the debt on the housing. So if I, on the project, so if my debt service exceeds the revenue that I make, that means that we get that, right? That I go under. And so that's a challenge. We were really fortunate, I think, when we just finished a smaller project, low-income housing in Meadowwood, in the Meadowwood neighborhood on Raven Road. And I can't say enough good things about the neighborhood association. I think there were some folks. Well, first of all, we've been there working for 12 years, and we, supported low-income housing in the neighborhood for 12 years. So we have a relationship with them. But I think there were some people who were very skeptical. But we worked with them, and we came up with a really good project. And I give them a lot of credit for being open-minded about but that is not the way it is. In a lot of places, we hide behind historic preservation and a lot of these other things to make sure that we can't actually develop housing. If you think about the size of the houses, that in some cases there's 2 or 1 person living in, and a lot of our isthmus neighborhoods, where you have the best transit, you have the best access to parks, you have the best access, all these things. It's very difficult to break that. So that's happening today. Still in terms of the environmental stuff, there's just a lot of this that is not, that hasn't gone away. But again, these are not easy things to do. And the city, as a municipality, is very limited in terms of what it can do alone. A lot of the things, like the thing I was saying about the restrictive covenants that remain on a lot of the deeds, that's actually a state statute. So the city, in and of itself, even the city, the zoning that supersedes local zoning authority. So if the city were to zone those areas a different way, it wouldn't matter, because that's still at the state level. And a lot of where you get the deepest pockets for a lot of this stuff is from the state and federal government. And so, the city does it, historically, they've done a lot. They do a lot. I mean, and this is what kind of goes back to what I was saying. I don't think that there's this cabal of people. It's like, you come up, as a researcher and academic, and you come up with all these things, and you run into the room and you're like, hey, I got all this stuff. And then you find out that everybody in there knows exactly everything that you're saying and has known about it. So, and they're like, hey, welcome to the party. Welcome home. It's great that you're back. So yeah, I would say that a lot of this stuff is still happening.
Yeah. Well, Justice, I don't know if you've been reading the chats, but there have been lots of folks thanking you for this presentation. One in particular, I'll tell you that somebody said that volatility and lack of transit really impacted her students when she was teaching in the school system, and that this really helped to make sense of that for her. So thank you very much.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you guys. And, I'll just say thank you so much for sharing the space. This is my home. I left for 20 years, 19 and a half years. And it's always been very hard. I mean, home sometimes doesn't mean the place that home can be painful, and what's the Aristotle is the unexamined life is not worth living. And Malcolm X's take on that was the examined life is painful. And so I think with a lot of this stuff, I hope audaciously, and I really do appreciate the fact that there are folks like you guys who are looking at this stuff, who are looking for the little ways and the little things that you can do, at least in terms of thinking about this. So thank you so much for inviting me and for sharing the space with me.
Yeah. Thank you. So we at St. Andrews will be having ongoing conversations about ways that we can make a difference. I see folks are asking that question in the chat. We are out of time this evening, but this conversation doesn't end for us tonight. So if you're not a member of St. Andrews, I know a lot of folks on this call tonight are not, but you would like to participate in those conversations, please do email me. You can do that through our website. We would love to have you participate. And we will be looking for ways as we continue to partner with Madison Roots to advocate for policy level changes and ways to help make a difference in the way that folks involved in the real estate industry operate. so that they're functioning in a more equitable way, and helping to combat the sort of less visible ways that redlining continues today. So thank you all again for being here this evening. This was really great. Justice, thank you so much. If it's all right with you, Justice, I'll be in touch later this week just so we can tie up loose ends and check in once again. Otherwise, thank you all so much and have a great remainder of your evening.
Righty, bye-bye.
Night.
Good night.